Shelley Jackson created her text, My Body, a Wonderkamer, to serve as a discussion of the association of body and image with human or self-identity. When the reader accesses the text for the first time, they're brought to this introductory screen. This screen contains information about the text itself, as well as the author, who seems to have a kind of obsession with image and compilation, as can be seen in her previous works listed here. The first sentence of the description, located in this part of the screen, allows the reader to identify the purpose of the text, which is to identify associations between identity and body, or appearance. Shelley Jackson uses limbs and organs of her own body to tell memoirs about the different events and circumstances in her life and the way that they pertain to the compilation of her own identity, as well as the way that other people in her life influence the way that she views herself and views other people in comparison. One aspect of Shelley Jackson's work that is consistently repeated is the presence of other people's reactions in her memoirs. In the shoulder section, this section here, we see the way that other people reacted to her Frankenstein appearance as she describes it. By comparing her own appearance to the appearance of those around her, as she does in this first paragraph, she differentiates herself from them, creating a sensation of abnormality. She claims she leers over them and that they laugh at her, causing her to feel like a Frankenstein monster. By including other people in her discussion of identity, the author alludes to the normative social and physical confines of other characters. The author sees herself the way she believes others see her, which is very important to further her discussion of what really makes up self-identity. Shelley Jackson gave us this menu with different parts of the body highlighted in squares and different elements of light, but the face isn't highlighted the way that the rest of the body is. And I think that this is because the author wants the reader to focus on the less obvious compositional elements of personality that are used to really make up identity. There's still stories associated with the face that you can access when different elements of the face are clicked on. For example, if one were to click on the nose, a story does pop up. It's just not obvious that it's there. And this story can also be accessed through other links in the text. For example, it applies to all elements of the face. If one enters the nose section and clicks on this link to my left eye, they're brought to the story associated with the eye. However, this story can also be accessed from the main menu where it's not highlighted by clicking on the eye, and you're brought to the same story. All of the in-text links are opportunities for the reader to dive farther into the study of identity of the narrator through the connections between the stories of her life. In the shoulder section, the reader views a face stating one jot off from a Frankenstein monster, here located in purple because I've already clicked on it. When the link is accessed, the story takes you to this description of this ampersand tattoo. It should look familiar because you also saw it here. If you click on the ampersand symbol off of the menu, the story is much shorter, and you can click on other links that lead you closer and closer to related elements to this ampersand symbol. By accessing the ampersand symbol through this text and receiving the longer story, it's obvious that it's related to both elements of the story, whether it be the right arm or the shoulder, but the stories are slightly different depending on which one you click on. The story of Frankenstein is applicable to both situations, and this indicates the extreme interconnection between the two elements and the story of the narrator, showing that every compositional element is important to this study of identity. Shelley Jackson's discussion of Frankenstein, as we can see here in this portion of the shoulder section, is significant not only to this text, but also Carving and Possibilities. Much like the way that Frankenstein's body parts each came from a different being with a different history, the limbs and parts of the narrator's body, as are described in this menu screen, are so associated with individual stories. Returning momentarily to the shoulder section, the reader can see that the composition of the entire screen not only includes the textual element, but the bodily element with which it corresponds. This is true for all of the bodies of text associated directly with the appearance or composition of a body part. For example, if one returns to the menu and were to click on the other shoulder, a drawing of this shoulder would be present also. This is true of the breasts and also of the navel, which gives a more complete bodily representation. Returning momentarily to the shoulder section, the reader can see that the composition of the entire screen not only includes the textual element, but the bodily element with which it corresponds. This is true for all of the bodies of text associated directly with the appearance or composition of a body part. For example, if one returns to the menu and were to click on the other shoulder, a drawing of this shoulder would be present also. This is true of the breasts and also of the navel, which gives a more complete bodily representation. Each of the stories associated with these pictures, which resemble woodcut drawings created by scraping away bits and pieces of the whole until the desired depiction is present, much like the cleaning away of flesh to view one's own personality, is associated with the story of how one is viewed by others, and how that in turn affected the way the narrator viewed the self. As can be seen with returning to the shoulder section, the narrator compares her body with that of Frankenstein because she does not look like the other girls that she sees. Because of these mixed interactions with other individuals, there's no clear-cut explanation for why the narrator is the way she is or feels the way she feels. To conclude discussions of this text individually, it can be stated that the way other people view and interact with an individual has a very strong effect on the way that one views oneself. Because others viewed her as anatomically incorrect, the narrator began to experience doubts about her own personality and sexuality, expressed on numerous occasions, especially in the shoulder section, as can be seen when she describes the interesting feeling of looking down at the bulge in her jeans. Therefore, while the expressions of others have a very strong effect on the way that one views oneself, appearance can be the source of the intentions of that interaction. This is why, in order to truly understand the nature of a person, it is important to look past the simplicity of facial features, as the author wants us to do, by highlighting these other important elements of the body for us to focus on the discussion of identity. Carving in Possibilities is another text that strongly reiterates this theme of identity and what elements make up identity. Like My Body, the author of this text emphasizes the influences of the outside world on perceptions of the self or the productions of the self. The introductory page is very important for this interpretation. The author chooses these words, "mouse slowly to carve out your experience very carefully." The reader is given the opportunity to choose which path the mouse should go, affecting the configuration of the arrangement of the elements of the story. However, you have to start with this click here. Upon entrance into the text, the reader is given the opportunity to begin moving the mouse very, very slowly to interact with the textual elements that are present. If the reader decides to preliminarily move the mouse towards the right as opposed to the left, they may end up with a different interpretation of the interconnections between the textual elements. This, however, suggests that the reader has primary control over the fate of the character. But is this necessarily true? The author indicates in certain textual inclusions that the outside world has a great impact not only on the created statue, but also on the creator himself. With regards to the effects of outside forces, the reader himself acts as an outside force that affects the identity of the sculpture that is built. Because the path that the reader chooses to take between the interconnected sentences or thoughts affects this interpretation, the relationship between the artist and the artwork can change. For example, throughout the text, as the reader moves their mouse, they're driven between different discussions, whether the artist is discussing elements of the stone or whether the stone itself is describing its own identity. For example, when the author describes, "I saw precisely what the stone was meant to be," it is very different from interpretations of, "When is it yours? When was it yours? Is it the author's or the artist or the stone's? Whose reality is true?" By stating "I," it's confusing whether we're hearing the discussion that David is having of his own identity or hearing that of the author. It becomes obvious that the stone has meaning. This meaning could be both for the artist and the viewer. Many artists would say that a small piece of them is embedded in every work of art they create. In this sense, the sculpture of David is in some form reflective of the identity of the author. Therefore, David discussing his own identity is therefore the author discussing his own identity as well. He could see what the stone was meant to be because it was a self-reflective creation. This moment also implies that there is a set relationship between the stone and what it displays for the reader or the audience. There's a specific visual coordination that the stone is meant to possess. Therefore, the audience would be able to identify that element. In this case, it would be necessary to appeal to the audience and relate them to a readable message, as well as relate the stone to that readable message and the artist or the creator, the outside force, to the self-identity of the stone. By including elements of the text that apply to reality, it is obvious that the author is trying to identify a kind of reality that is conflicted. Is it his reality or is it the stone's reality? The presence of other people within this reality, such as the allusion to yours and mine and the shuddering cameras of the audience, are reflective of the fact that there's other people present when interpreting one's own identity, and they're looking at the image and behaving in a certain way because of it. When introduced to society, reality can be unidentifiable to anybody but the self and can cause further conflict or misunderstanding. When was this his thought is another one of the textual elements that really leads me to believe that one's thought and self-perception is interpreted by the actions and behaviors of others. Interactions between beings would in turn further affect self-identity. This interaction becomes clear with inclusions such as this one, because it points out the presence of other beings when observing personality traits. The author of this text also emphasizes the importance of surface appearance to this interpretation. It is the visual material itself, the stone, and in this description, the hands, the neck, and the eyes, that cause the audience to question its identity and purpose, giving the work, the sculpture, humanistic qualities. The text proposes questions such as, when is the stone stone? And did they furrow impossible brows and decline your offers? To relate the audience to the stone in an interaction such as a conversation, causing the reader to think of the text in relation to their own body and identity as an object. To see you as God is another relationship between the artist, the audience, and the sculpture that relates this conversation to one between man and object. By leading the reader to view their own identity in relation to this text, they're forced to mold the composition of the David statue in their own hands. Along with the propositions of the text, the introductory description is correct to say that the reader is carving out their own reality through putting themselves in the position of David through the movement of this mouse. Because the movement of the mouse leads the relationship between the composed and the audience, it affects the interpretation of the artwork and one's own self-identity, just like the constructs in my body. The author further humanizes the sculpted face on the screen by corresponding textual elements with facial features from which that element of personality would originate. For example, honesty is something that's spoken. It comes from the heart, but it's something that physically leaves through your lips. By placing this textual element in red, the color commonly associated with lips and the location of the lips on the face of the statue, it suggests that the stone itself contains life and identity capable of producing one's own opinions and honesty. This humanistic feature is continued in the perceptions produced through vision, allowing for the stone to see the way it is being viewed and described, leading to conceptions and also reflections and imperfections. I firmly believe that reading My Body first really changed the way that I interpreted certain elements in Carving Impossibilities. And those elements were always present, but they were made more obvious because I already had this theme of identity in my head. For example, in Carving Impossibilities, the opening screen states, "Carve out your existence." But once one goes through the text, they are given this option to sculpt again for another reality. While indicating that the reader has control over the storyline through their movement of the mouse, the textual elements are set to the position of the mouse that the reader scrolls over. Just like how in My Body, certain bodies of text were associated with a specific element of the body and had to be accessed in a certain way to understand the relation with that element of the body. With this set value of textual inclusion, it's obvious that a certain amount of meaning behind each text is meant to be a definite interpretation. The proposed theme of relation between identity and body found in Shelley Jackson's memoirs is also present in Carving Impossibilities. By stating who breathed life into whom, it is brought to the reader's attention that while one's identity brings life to society, society also contributes elements to that interpretation. Because the second text requires the reader to relate their own identity to the interpretation, it could be argued that the text or sculpture itself is the source of the awareness of the reader's identity, being the cause of that thought process. However, it is the mind of the reader that interprets the true nature of how the textual elements of this text are related, bringing humanistic qualities of the stone to that individual's attention. The way that others viewed the narrator's body in negative comparison to what was considered normative for a female affected the way that she began to interpret her own appearance and behavior. Just after the story of the Frankenstein monster or this relation, we find this section that relates to the way that she felt about her own appearance. As was mentioned previously, she even began to question the effeminate aspects of her personality and sexuality, which are a big part of identity, and began to identify herself more closely with males in some respects, particularly in regards to the penis bulge and the masculine appearance of her body with broad shoulders and muscular arms. This emphasizes appearance as a source of the interaction between individuals that causes an interpretation of the way that they relate information in regards to you, thus causing an interpretation in one's own mind that leads to identity. The focus is equally important in My Body as it is in Carving Impossibilities because the visual appearance is the source of the interaction between the characters as well as between the reader and the text, which leads to the way that one interprets identity.